I'm sure people will continue to trickle in, but we will kick off here with a welcome to Seb and Xochi to Kernel Block 5, which is a really, really wonderful place on a small corner of the internet. And it is populated by some really, really incredible people that you can use all sorts of titles and identities to describe. And those help us for sure to get a grapple on all of the incredible things that are going on in a kernel block. But it's our intention over the course of the 8 weeks, more than anything, to create a space where these people can get to know each other, can explore Web3 together, and perhaps even more so, explore themselves. And this block, we're lucky to be joined by almost 450 kernel fellows, which is the largest group by kind of a country mile, and many of them are here with us today. So we're really excited for you to get to know them. They just went through a week called Wander Week, which was a really wonderful time where people were exploring ideas about Web3. It's early enough in the program that perhaps the focus is just starting to shift from getting to know each other to thinking through the types of ideas that they may want to explore. And there were well over 100 projects that were represented in Wander Week, which was simultaneous to Denver, which is kind of the craziest part in my mind. Some of these people were in Denver, many were not. One of those people was Sam He, who designed this beautiful POAP and distributed it to all of the people in the kernel block. So we're really, really grateful to Sam for his efforts here, and he has an incredible project of his own that he presented during Wander Week. And we just want to call out one other project quickly. Fang, Granada, and Sam have also been helping with a translation effort, translating the kernel syllabus to Spanish using the guide that Andy put together many, many blocks ago. And it's really, really meaningful to have seen that. We want to call them out for the work they've done. So thank you for that. And yeah, that brings us to kind of like, hopefully, a slightly slower part of kernel, which I know we always aim for and don't always succeed, but we do really have 2 quieter weeks where the focus starts to trend more internal. There's less external stimulus. The interest channel is not all intros every day. It's been 2 weeks and people are starting to get settled. And we have until March 7th for Expo Week. And if you've already kind of started your adventure, that means that the artifact that you submitted for Wander Week is really something that could be refined or continued, or as is, might be good to present during Expo Week, where we'll invite at least 50 mentors from the industry along with guides, and you'll be able to present science fair style to at least 2 different groups of people that come around to see what you're up to. But in advance, we just have a couple of quiet weeks where we hope that through office hours and through the guilds, you can settle into a bit more of a focus of where it is that you intend to go with your particular adventure. Wonderful. So that's a bit of framing on where we are. I'll pass the mic to Andy quickly to talk us through where we are on the syllabus, and then we'll start to get to our wonderful guests.
I'm so relieved to have my co-conspirator back in action. Yeah, I feel a huge weight off my shoulders if I can now return to my playful role and let you manage all of the ops. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you back. I hope you enjoyed your ski slopes and all of the things which have gone on in Denver. The short version of this is that this week, after having been through pattern, playfulness, trust, meaning, and value, we get to 2 critical aspects that align with the slower part of kernel's more intentional focus for these 2 weeks, which is asking better questions and thinking very deeply about money and speech. These 2 things go in tandem, because when we learn the limits within which we play, the conventions that hold the infinite game we hope to aim for, then we can understand much more about what freedom really means. There's a wonderful quote from Cloud Atlas, which is a favorite movie of mine, that freedom is the fatuous jingle of a generation that has never had it taken away, and it's only those in chains who really know what it means. It is such people to whom we look for creative ideas around expression, broadly put, which is what we will hopefully spend a lot of time discussing with our two delightful guests today. And in tandem with that, we need to think more deeply about what it means to ask really good questions, how it is that we get out of the egoic frame of mind, which is constantly trying to put itself forward as knowing a lot, as being an expert, as having the most informed opinion, and turn and recognize this extraordinarily simple truth that being taught by others does not demean us, it uplifts us, right? And when we are in that state of beginner's mind, of recognizing each moment as it arises freshly and without any prior experience, then we can cultivate the internal states required to both learn deeply and relate to others in much more meaningful, open, warm-hearted ways. From that kind of place, we can begin to think more clearly about what meaningful expression really is, what this thing of creating value with your speech really means. Because when you sign a transaction and broadcast it on one of these networks these days, it is a speech act which is simultaneous with the creation and distribution of value. It is the collapse of free as in speech and free as in beer. And what it points at is not a new kind of language. It points at cardinality, right? It points at a new order of thing equivalent to language. So we're not speaking about something like JavaScript or Esperanto or Python or Clojure or one of these new kinds of language. We're speaking at a shift in our expressive ability of the order of language itself, potentially. We've talked a little bit about this in terms of looking at decentralized systems and noting that the only fully decentralized system that we have is language, because no one person owns the meaning of words. And money and speech extends that idea that no one person owns the meanings of words. They are arrived at consensually through use in conversation with others to the economic realm, which is where we're going to go today. And in order to get us there with no guardrails, saying, "Look ma, no hands," in another delightful South African accent, I love her dearly, is Rebecca Camelo, who will be talking about DeFi to frame the discussion.
Thank you, Andy. It's so good to be back. I do this for each block on the global money. And what I'm really excited about in this conversation is that our understanding of money has evolved so much based on everything that has happened in the space around us. But I also want to appreciate that not everyone coming into Kernel is deeply familiar with the DeFi space or decentralized finance. And so I'm going to do my best to just break that down slightly and use that as a segue to Sep and Sochi. So if we can do the next slide, thanks Vivek. Let's start with what is DeFi. And really simply, decentralized finance is just finance reimagined in permissionless, programmable, and composable form. Now, permissionless just means that there are no gatekeepers restricting who can create and participate in any service that is related to decentralized finance. So if you have ever set up an Ethereum wallet or you've used a decentralized app, you'll notice that there is seldom anything like KYC measures. So no one really cares what country you're from or how much you earn or whether you meet certain criteria. It's accessible to everyone. And then programmable means that we're using a decentralized universal settlement layer. Typically, this might be the Ethereum blockchain, but honestly, this could be any blockchain. And this removes the need for third parties to facilitate transactions. And that would usually be your banks and intermediaries. And interesting to note that at every single point of there being an intermediary, that usually ramps up the cost of participating. And then lastly, composable just means that different applications can be built on top of each other. And an analogy or metaphor that we like to use in DeFi is Lego. So hence the image on the right. You can, combine a lending service with a borrowing service, with a investment service, and basically stack those all together and get really creative with the kinds of products that you build. So just to give you an example, in traditional finance, we might talk about having a bank account. In decentralized finance, we would talk about you being your own bank, because once you have an Ethereum wallet, there's no one that can access those funds or have custody over them unless you give them permission to do so. But also, really importantly, is why DeFi? And DeFi has emerged as an answer to what is really just a very gated, expensive, inefficient, and exclusionary nature of centralized finance. And if you go into the next slide, Vivek, this is just sort of an overview of looking at all the different functions of money or functions of finance that really translate over into decentralized protocols and apps. But I also want to move on to talking a little bit about why this moment in history is so important. Because DeFi is really disrupting the supply and distribution of money. And this has really far-reaching consequences. It has consequences on financial markets. As we've seen, it has consequences for organizational structure when we're now able to deploy money in new ways. So think about tokenized voting with DAOs. We are able to play around with different funding models using that new money Lego. And we're also seeing a lot happening in the creator economy. And the way that I like to see it is that this is actually just an arc of history that people have been talking about for a really, really long time. And I wanted to highlight Friedrich Hayek here, the Austrian economist. So in 1976, he published a book called The Denationalization of Money, where he envisioned a world of competing currencies. And arguably, we've entered into that era. Interestingly, in 1984, he's quoted saying, "Oh, I don't believe we'll ever have good money again before we take it out of the hands of government. We can't take it violently, but what we can do is by some sly, roundabout way, introduce something that they can't stop." And if anyone's reading or listening to that, that seems very familiar, because I think that that's what we've built in the form of public blockchains and accessible decentralized finance. But this is where things get really weird and wonky, because then you realize that we're actually entering what Balaji Srinivasan, who's former CTO of Coinbase, would call the DeFi matrix, a global decentralized exchange where everything is valued against everything. So in a world where we can tokenize not just money, but also votes, even identity, ownership, you now have a ledger where everything is constantly quantified and understood as relative to other things. And this means that our definitions of money really do need to expand beyond traditional use cases. So textbook definitions would be, unit of account, store of value, medium of exchange. And I think in this conversation, we're really going to dig into how that expands to possibly a universal ledger of transactions, measures of care, identifiers on who you are, and like where, if you have DAO tokens or you belong to a city and you have money that is specific to that, what we are doing is just opening up the way that we can deploy money. And to tie this all back to language, one of my favorite quotes by Wittgenstein is that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And another favorite quote of mine is by my dear friend, Anna Santasheva, who characterizes crypto and DeFi as a shift in the linguistic paradigm that we have for transfer of value. And when you open up the language that we can use, it changes our behavior and the way that we deploy money and value. And so I'm going to stop there because I know that Sep and Xochi have so much to add on this, on how we understand money and how that evolves. But if you take away anything from this, there's a lot that you can do decentralized finance, but there's also this very large underlying shift in the fundamentals of what is money.
I told you, right? It's just these South African accents rolling one after the other. Enough to convince you that we really can't do it all. In order to introduce Sep and Xochi, we thought that touching on this particular video, which is linked in this week's module, would be a great way to do it. it is set in conversation with Naval. And he mentions 5 features of money that we can think about creating or engineering in better ways, which we think will serve us as a great framework for discussion for the rest of this chat. And these 5 features are UBI, or some kind of basic dividend, which is linked to the creation of money itself. Demurrage, which we will discuss, a very interesting idea. Natural capital backed currencies, which is an idea that comes from Charles Eisenstein, who is also spoken of in module 7. If you want to skip forward in the syllabus and go and think about sacred economics now, that is the place to go and do so. As well as local currencies and money that is no longer tied to interest-bearing debt. These are 5 fascinating features that we can think of implementing with programmable money. But one of the reasons that we have invited Sochi and Seth to talk with us today is because it's not just these 5 really interesting practical features that we can talk about endlessly. It's the fact that they are underpinned by these 2 points of unique purpose and connectedness. This notion of unique purpose and connectedness is critical to the work that both of them do at Celo, and it has informed a fascinating and vibrant culture in that particular organization, which reflects some of their ideas about how to actually implement the rather beautiful and high-minded ideas of UBI, natural capital-backed currencies, interests, money that is no longer tied to debt, these kinds of things. So I think as a starting point, I would love to ask Seth to speak just a little bit about what you mean by UBI, or a dividend that is fundamentally baked into the monetary system, where you came up with that idea from, and how it has worked out over the last 3 or 4 years as Celo has moved forward.
Yeah, lovely. Maybe what I'll do is, even before getting there, because that gets brass tacks right away, and maybe I'll frame it by kind of, where does unique purpose and connectedness come from in the first place? Why those values? And then why do these features arise from those values? And then I can get to why, like, how does UBI, how can you create a UBI in monetary policy directly? And so let me start by kind of like, why the values? And I'll start by talking about mycelium. Mycelium is, we know mycelium above ground as mushrooms, but underground there's thousands of miles of mycelial network in every square foot of forest. Trees use mycelium to talk to one another. And when you look at mycelial network under a microscope, it looks like a nervous system. In fact, it is a nervous system. It is a biological network that passes messages and performs computations. And when I saw that, I could never unsee it, because there's 2 things that come out of it. First, in a world where we know that our own intelligence arises from the neural networks in our brains and our hearts and our guts, and artificial intelligence arises from the deep networks that we program into our computers, what does it say about the intelligence of a forest whose neural networks are much more intricate than ours? And I only come to one conclusion, which is that the forest is intelligent in ways that we cannot yet understand, because their intelligence is so deep. So the second thing that comes out of it is, in a world where a forest has a nervous system, what is the organism? Is it the tree, or is it the forest? And when I think about that hard enough, the only conclusion that I come to is that we are, at every level, from cell all the way to entire Earth, both ecosystem and organism. We are both a whole and a part. And the science fiction writer Arthur Koestler has a word for this, words for things that are a whole and a part, which he called a holon. And he said the universe is made up of interlocking holons. And this is true, but I don't actually need to know about holons or mycelium to feel the truth of this. Like, I feel that I am a whole. And at the same time, I feel that I'm part of something greater than myself. And as a whole, I need agency. And as a part, I need communion. As a whole, I have a unique purpose. And as a part, I am connected to all things. And so it is that, from there that arises the two Celo values of unique purpose and connectedness. And, you know, when I talk about it like that, these sounds like facts rather than values. It sounds obvious, except for the fact that so much of our society is organized as if the opposite were true. Like if you take a look at modern suburbia, houses look like one another, so it doesn't honor unique purpose. At the same time, we don't have courtyards and common greens, so it doesn't honor connectedness. If we look at modern schooling, everyone learns the same thing at the same time, so it doesn't honor unique purpose. But heaven forbid, you help a friend on a test, and so it doesn't honor connectedness. And so the question the motivating question for Celo was, how do you create a financial system that honors unique purpose and connectedness? So let me pause there because I said a bunch, and so I'll let you follow. If I can kind of follow this with kind of how that leads to 5 features, and then actually answer the question that you asked. But I wanted to start with this framing.
It's beautiful. Thank you very much. The chat is going wild with excitement about many of the metaphors that you chose there. I would also like to invite Sochi, just given this framing. I know that Celo works along the lines of holons. It uses circles. Much of the imagery that Seth has laid as a foundation for us here is implemented in your organizational methodology. But one of the things that I want to kind of hone in on is, can you talk a little bit about your understanding of intelligence? This notion that we are both ecosystem and organism, and that the forest has a neural network far more complex than our own, and yet allows us to destroy parts of it. It inherits, or it hints at something really interesting about the nature of intelligence at the level of the ecosystem, which is really fascinating to think about. And I know that you head up ecosystem growth. I wonder how you think about this collective intelligence and how you try to foster and cultivate that in your work, and where you think it might lead you in the years to come, given this beautiful vision of a wonderful man sitting next to you.
Yes, definitely. I can get started. And I think I'll just take a minute just to talk about my own personal journey, because I think this impacted a lot of, I think, being at Celo and a lot of the work that we're doing. So I was born and raised in Silicon Valley in California. My mother is actually from Mexico, from a small town that had a population of less than 200. In the last 5 years, had the first paved road. And so I saw this kind of dichotomy, what was happening in the valley, right? This abundance of wealth, abundance of technology, and also just this lack of it. And was really drawn to crypto with this, ability to democratize wealth and democratize technology. So much of what we do at the Celo Foundation is really grounded in how do we kind of connect the world in ways that they're not today. And so that's working with founders that are based in, Uganda, that are doing like important work. Like we talked about Impact Market, the work that Marco's been doing in Brazil, to name just one of the many countries that he's working in. And so I think that, as we think about the ecosystem, we look at it as a whole. I think, to introduce another analogy, I think that it is in many ways this sort of like constellation of different applications. Rebecca used Legos, which I think is like another great way of thinking about it. But when we think about, using crypto or using Celo, you can see use cases where people are receiving universal basic income, right? We now see these organic and local ecosystems beginning to evolve. People are not only receiving money, but able to use, it to purchase groceries at the end of the week, or use it to stake and suddenly earn yield, right? Perform micro work tasks on their telephone and receive income. And I think all of this is possible with the work that we're doing with crypto, right? So it's not just one application, but how many of these applications work together to change lives. And I think in a way that, we haven't been able to imagine like before. And that's something that I'm really excited about the work that we're doing at the ecosystem, is how do these all begin to kind of connect together to really kind of show, this pathway that I don't think was always available before. Right?
It's stunning. Thank you. Yeah. The interesting paradox and tension between the felt recognition of wholeness and the urge toward communion as a part that we all kind of inherently, by virtue of our birthright, recognize that everything is always connected, and yet there is always this work to be done to make the connections as well, is something that I spend a great deal of my time thinking about, that there is one remembrance and recognition of the fact that everything is always connected, and yet still striving efforts, ecosystem work, the very necessary wiring of all of the Lego bricks together to build something less random and more beautiful. And Seth, this notion of beauty is something which really seems to inform and ground a lot of your work. I think that we got a taste of that in your initial introduction there. And I wonder, like natural metaphors really ground so much of what you have talked about, and hopefully will tell us more about now. We mentioned the mycelia, and this notion of UBI or universal dividend. It seems to offer some of the connections. What Sochi is saying there, what I hear is that people can use and pay if we make all of these connections so much more easily, so much more seamlessly. Money is really just this flow of energy through a system that enables like beautiful expression. And I've heard you talk about UBI and dividends as a water cycle. So can you connect some of these up for us here? Beauty and water and UBI, and how they all play together with your two principles.
Yeah, it's lovely. So maybe what I'll kind of, I will kind of both draw from what I had said before and also frame it in the context of technology expanding expressive range, basically. And so this is how I'll say it, is, in the mid-1800s, there were 3 inventions around painting. One was the metal paint tube. Before the metal paint tube, people would use pig bladders to store their paints. The second was the collapsible easel. And the third was the metal ferrule. The ferrule is a part of the paintbrush, the part of the paintbrush between the handle and the brush. And prior to the metal ferrule, people would use like wire or thread, and so they could only have round paintbrushes, whereas the metal ferrule allowed for flat paintbrushes, which in turn allowed for a style of painting called the impasto effect, where people would dab quickly against the canvas. So the metal ferrule allowed for the impasto effect, and the paint tube and the collapsible easel allowed people to bring their work outside and paint natural landscapes. And the combination of those two led to a form of painting that we now know as Impressionism. And it's remarkable that kind of technological innovations led to this great beauty. But I think that is actually a more common story than we give it credit. Technological innovations expand the expressive range of a medium, and then one can use that expressive range to convey a beauty that was not able to be conveyed before with the previous technology. And so with the blockchain, we have that around money, basically. The blockchain increases the expressive range around money. And so it allows us to think about what are the features of money that could make for a more beautiful world, for a more prosperous society. And I think the way that I'll frame it, since Andy, you kind of read off these 5 features, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of frame it in the context of monetary policy. If I were to kind of describe monetary policy as simply as possible, I would say is monetary policy is how does money come into existence? Right now, we have a very narrow expressive range of monetary policy. Right now, all money comes into existence through lending it into existence at interest. And as a consequence, there's always more debt than there is money. And so we have through, and basically all debates around monetary policy are just simply around what is the interest rate at which we lend money into existence. But never is there a debate around monetary policy as like, are there other ways to bring money into existence? And so a drawback, I mean, I would say at the beginning of the industrial age, this lending money into existence was super interesting. It impelled growth, and that growth has been good for us. We've grown our way out of a lot of our problems. But now, as the Earth is reaching its carrying capacity, it's not clear that we can grow our way out of our problems. And if we think about kind of the consequences to the scarcity that we have introduced technically through that monetary policy, where there's always more debt than there is money, there's only 2 ways out. One is growth, and the other is default, basically. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing growth through the eating through our natural resources, and we're seeing default, and default that creates inequality. And so these are the 2 biggest problems of our day, is environmental destruction and massive inequalities. And so the question becomes, what are some other more beautiful ways of bringing money into existence? And I can imagine a number. I can imagine universal basic income money into existence. I could imagine gifting money into existence for people who are doing pro-social things in the world, like taking care of young children or the elderly. I can imagine people earning money into existence by doing things like planting trees. I could imagine exchanging money into existence. We had that with gold, but we could imagine exchanging it through forest or clean rivers. We could imagine exchanging those for money and creating a natural reserve of pristine forests and clean rivers. And one that's a little bit harder to describe, but I'll do my best here, is you can even imagine spending it into existence. So my friend Charles Eisenstein, he has said, you know, if you bury a bunch of money in the ground, does it exist? And the answer is no. Like, money exists in exchange, basically. Like, if you take it out of supply forever, it does not exist. And so it exists through the flow. And so by incentivizing circulation, that is another piece of monetary policy. It's another way to bring money into existence. And so those 5 features of UBI, demurrage, natural capital-backed currencies, these features are really kind of alternative monetary policies that are enabled by the new technologies that we now have with the blockchain. And so really kind of oh, well, actually, I'll say one more thing to answer your question. So when I talk about UBI and demurrage, UBI is basically kind of one monetary policy that's a kind of a fair way to kind of bring money into existence that doesn't introduce by nature inequality, as opposed to kind of debt-based money. But demurrage is a way to keep it into circulation, basically. And you can see these as you can see this like the water cycle. I mean, there are two sides of the same coin. UBI is like rain, it ensures universal health. And demurrage is like evaporation. It ensures non-stagnation. And you can see a demurrage charge basically funding the UBI so that it's not just analogous, it's actually explicit. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yes, it absolutely does in so many ways. And I have so many things still to say, but I know that Rebecca has a few questions and I would love to hear them first. Thank you, Seb.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Seb. I really also just love all the analogies coming in from nature. I get the water cycle now, that the rain and evaporation, I've never thought about it that way. I think that something that's also possibly top of mind for people, in this Zoom room is we have all of these really creative experiments around money supply and expanding access to money, but possibly a tension that exists for many of us is we look at the tools that we have and we look at the ideals that now become possible and we look at what we're currently doing with it. And I think for many people, when they think of crypto or decentralized finance, they're saying, yes, but I'm also seeing a concentration of wealth. I'm also seeing barriers that are so clearly there that maybe we sometimes just want to ignore. A really practical example might be, people can have access to staking or even forms of UBI or new yield strategies. But for example, if all the banks in Nigeria suddenly decide that you can't cash that out, what do you do? So there's this tension as we try and weave in these more beautiful ways of doing and giving and creating money with the systems that be and the sometimes the incentive from certain actors to maintain that status quo. And I think I'd really love to hear also from Xochi, because you're so hands-on in this with ecosystem growth. How do you navigate that friction that's always going to be there?
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think let me start by just addressing, I think the dichotomy issue. We recently launched this initiative called DeFi for the people, and it was basically focused on, how do we try to address this, right? DeFi primarily, I think there are studies that show concentrated at the top 1%, right, that are participating in DeFi. And really, there's a great article for those of you that are interested that talk about DeFi's first world country problem that was written by the Defiant. And they specifically talked about this. And so what we tried to do with this initiative is, how do we make this more accessible to everyone, right? And if you think about some of those barriers to entry, there are a couple, right? One is that it can be very difficult to use the UX, right? Just in terms of understanding, can be hard. Cashing in and cashing out, there are barriers to entry as well, as you mentioned, that I think is like another big piece of that. And then I think the third is just really kind of like some of the fees that are, associated with being able to participate in DeFi today, right? Can be quite difficult for those, quite frankly, that don't have that money to spare. And so what we really tried to do was, how do we work, through this coalition of projects, of initiatives that really care deeply about, how do we make this more accessible. What's interesting is that if you look at, Celo is the mobile first blockchain. If you look at mobile phone penetration, that is only continuing to increase. I think the latest Ericsson report had 8 billion mobile phones. 86% of those were were smartphones, and we're not talking like the latest like Apple or the latest Android, right? But just even $20 phones. And so a lot of what Celo was optimized for was, how do we make it more accessible for that $20 phone that you may be buying in like Sierra Leone, right? I think that the accessibility is a big piece. I talked very briefly about it in the last question. I'll kind of dive a little bit deeper in. Celo's mission is to build an open financial system that creates these conditions of prosperity for all. In the last few weeks, we worked with last few months, we worked with a project in Kenya that was focused on really enabling micro work. I think this builds off of like some of the things that Seb touched on earlier, right? But it's how do you perform tasks on a mobile phone? In today's world, you may get paid in 2 weeks, right? You may have a large percentage of that's taken away in fees, right? And what we were able to do in working with Mercy Corps and an organization called Corsali was have people get paid instantaneously right after performing that micro task. Willie, who is part of the cohort, just put in the link in the chat and was responsible for kind of driving a lot of this work throughout the ecosystem. And I think that's one aspect, right? How do we get I think crypto into the hands and everyone? I saw some of the questions that were in the chat as well. I think this is a big piece of it, making it kind of more accessible. We talked about also UBI impact market, which was part of kernel cohort 1, has deployed UBI in 165 communities in 30 countries all around the world. I think 1.7 million to date. And I think that's another example of like what you're seeing, that people are able to kind of perceive, some of these funds. And I think the utility of it is a big piece, right? And so the question that you asked about like Nigeria and some of the crypto regulations, right? That's a big piece of it. Are people still able to use it? Are they able to like top up their cell phones? Are they able to buy groceries, right? I think it's another big aspect. So when we think about the ecosystems, we're looking at, not just one project, right? But like, how do we kind of come together, right? To really, provide a suite of, of services that are available for that community. And I think that's a big aspect of it. I am quite hopeful with, where governments stand. I think you've seen like some of the position that El Salvador has taken. I'm seeing other countries in Latin America that are starting to kind of become more, I think, a lot more open to crypto in ways that we haven't seen before. Even in the United States, you have, states like Tennessee, right, that are really forward thinking about crypto and how we use this to solve some of the challenges that they're seeing like on the ground. And so I think this is one thing that I'm like really optimistic about. But I think, to go back to your question, I think there's this utility element, right? How do we distribute it into the hands of everyone so that it is like, fair? We're making it easy, right, for people to use, and they're able to use it in their everyday lives as well, right?
Thank you. Yeah, and I also just wanted to flag, if anyone is interested, I know that there is a kernel conversation happening in exactly 3 hours on crypto and political climate in Latin America. So I think I definitely share so much of what you're saying around there's always going to be these moving parts that we have to navigate, and some of it is going to happen naturally. Some of it is going to, governments are going to have to come around when it comes to things like regulation. But there's also the things that we can be doing as organizations and as the community in the way that we design and the assumptions that we make in that design. And I think being mobile first is like a really obvious one.
Can I add a couple things, one technical and one metaphysical, because it's a very rich question and it's worth diving in depth on that. So one is, I mean, to Sochi's point, like basically kind of so much of the design technically of Celo was intended for accessibility. So, I mean, things that are non-obvious when you're designing a layer one, like scalability, because scalability leads to low gas fees, which makes it work for people who are not working with large transactions, like super efficient like client support, and the ability to pay gas fees in stablecoin. It's very difficult to basically use money as your medium of transaction when you have to pay fees in a different currency at the same time. So a lot of kind of all of the technical decisions behind Celo were conditioned on how do we make something that both creates the conditions for prosperity for all, and also creates the conditions for a regenerative financial system. And those are, at some point we should kind of do a technical deep dive and kind of show where the philosophy kind of led to kind of like explicit technical decisions and technical innovations. But I have a metaphysical thing about this as well, which is we're at the very beginnings, I mean, of a very long shift in what money looks like. I mean, the last time we've really seen this has been kind of the mid 1600s with the introduction of fiat. And so it's tempting to think that like we'll solve these problems in these next 20 years, but really we're thinking about these in the next 100 years, basically. And doing that reminds me of a metaphor and model for how to make change, or two different metaphors and models of how to make change. The first metaphor is, I'd say, kind of the traditional old metaphor, which is the metaphor of redemptive violence. It's the fight between good and evil. And you see evil out in the world, or you see something, it doesn't have to be evil, you see something bad out in the world, and you fight it, basically. And you have your new thing, and that new thing wins. And that metaphor was, I mean, both like very present in the creation myth of Sumer, and also like very present in Popeye. Like Popeye, basically, kind of every episode is the myth of redemptive violence. Blutus like is abducting olive oil. Popeye sees the evil, fights it. There's a big fight. He's losing. He eats his spinach and then saves olive oil, and then good wins over bad, basically. But the problem with that myth is nobody ever learns anything. I mean, Blutus never learns to not abduct olive oil. Popeye never learns not to eat his spinach before the fight, or to eat his spinach before the fight. And so I want to kind of present an alternative metaphor, which is the metaphor of morphic resonance, which says, if you do anything, no matter how small, but you do it with love and care and kindness and well-intention, it will have an impact, a resonance far beyond the thing itself, in ways that you can't really see in this time. And so I think part of the answer to that is a morphic resonance answer, is to do something beautiful, no matter how small, and trust that it will have a resonance beyond that and an impact beyond that in planting the seeds for this shift in these next 100 years.
Amazing. Thank you, Seb. Thank you so much. I think we have about 10 minutes left, and there's lots of interesting things in the chat that we could explore. I think be nice to get to some of those. And if we could, maybe, and I know we don't have that much time, so this will be tricky, but there are some questions about demurrage and UBI. Specifically, Riley brings up a conversation about UBI versus UBS, especially given the identity considerations and concerns around successfully implementing UBI. And then demurrage kind of questions, concerns about the considerations of property rights and expiration dates. How do you think about designing those in beautiful, resonant ways?
Yeah, I can start, and let me start. There was a couple of comments around UBIs. One was also around a UMI that I wanted to touch on briefly before talking about kind of implementation considerations around UBIs. But the UMI, there's this great philosopher named Ivan Illich. He's just like one of the most thoughtful thinkers that I've encountered. And he has a book called Energy and Equity. And what he says is, he says, you know, like when you think about equity, you have to think about the equitable proportion of energy. And so basically kind of, he started out by proposing kind of like a cap on energy usage, basically. But what he said is, he said, you know, because so much of the world's energy is consumed through transportation, he said that aligns with a speed limit. And he did the calculations, and he said that speed limit is a speed limit of about 15 miles an hour. It's about the speed of riding a bike. And he presented this beautiful vision of like bike streets, basically, that could have like golf cart type transportation as well, and creating community. So I just wanted to bring that up as a side comment in thinking about that line of thinking. But speaking about design implementations of UBIs, I mean, let me start out by saying, if you take a look at extending the franchise, the right to vote, to women in the United States, it started out, the first state that did that was, I'm going to mess up the dates, but it was like, it was Wyoming in, I think it was like 1860, basically. And Wyoming at the time had 7,000 people, 6,000 men and 1,000 women. And so it was like a neighborhood in Philadelphia. But that kind of, and really it was intended to encourage people to move to Wyoming. It was a perk of living in Wyoming. But that kind of served as an example. And then a few years later, Colorado extended the franchise. And a couple years after that, I forget, it was like California. And then a few years after that, 8 states. And then in the next few years, it was 8 states. In the next few years, it was 16 states. And then, and it was at that point that the Supreme Court came and made the decision. And if you look at most big social change Supreme Court cases in the United States, they all happened that way. It started very local. That local served as an example for a few more, which served as an example for a few more. And basically kind of the change became viral, but it started very small, very locally. So let me now kind of paint a thought experiment, which is, say I had a small organic grocery co-op, and I wanted to give coupons to people in the neighborhood, basically. And I decided to give coupons to everybody in the neighborhood surrounding it. if they come shop, their first $10 are free, basically. And you know, I'd want the coupon to expire. So let's say I expired in a year. But actually, you know, like if I implement these coupons on the blockchain, I don't have to have it expire in a year. I could have it expire slowly. And I can immediately give it to everybody in the neighborhood digitally. And what do I have? I have a demurrage charge local functional currency that's brought into existence through a UBI. And so my instinct is that like the way these big changes to monetary policy will be made is at these small scales. There will be lots of experiments on monetary design through things like grocery stores giving coupons and having expiration dates on coupons. And then all of a sudden you have a UBI and demurrage experiment.
So could you also tell us a little bit about the story of Curitiba and the bus tokens?
Yeah, totally. It's so influential. It's been so influential on us at Celo. Basically, it was in the 1990s, the city of Curitiba in Brazil had a forward-thinking mayor. And in the favelas, there was a garbage problem. The streets were too narrow for garbage trucks. Oh, so it's Curritiba. Yes, that's right. So basically, there was a garbage problem because the streets in the favelas were too narrow to be navigated by garbage trucks. And so garbage would flow into the streets and then into the surrounding rivers. And so the mayor put into, and at the same time, there was a new bus system and that was below capacity. And so the mayor of Curitiba said, hey, listen, you can exchange garbage for bus tokens. And so people would, in the favelas, exchange garbage for bus tokens and then use the bus tokens to go downtown to go to work. But at a certain point, those bus tokens started circulating in the favelas as currency. And so that allowed people to clean up much more garbage than they needed for their bus rides because they could use it to spend on food or other things. And so this was like a lovely example of a functional local currency complementary to the Brazilian real, earned into existence by environmental remediation, and that helped to bring prosperity to the favelas in Curitiba. And it's just beautiful. I mean, and you know, technology allows things like this to happen at much bigger scales. Like, I mean, blogs existed before the internet as zines, but if you had told me that like at a certain point, like everybody would be reading zines like on a weekly basis, I'd be like, no, there's no way, you know, but now they do, you know? And so that story forms, it's like the grocery store story. It forms an example of something that is beautiful and scalable with technology.
I know there are many more questions. I want to pose one thing before we might potentially have to lose some of our speakers, is that Sep, one of the aspects of your thoughts, which has bled into many parts of Celo's design, which speaks so deeply to the work that we do at Kernel as well, is this notion of resonance and narrative architecture. The idea that one can tell the story, the right people will hear it, find their place within it, and expand its meaning in order to find some kind of architecture. And one of the thoughts I have around this, which I would like to share at the end of this and perhaps get both your and Sochi's feedback on it, is that one of the most powerful stories about what wealth is fundamentally is that it means two things which are deeply interrelated in the same way that your ecosystem and organism or whole and part is. Wealth means having enough, knowing that I am already, by virtue of who I am, enough. And by virtue of that knowing, wealth is having enough to share. And for me, it's really interesting, when we talk about accessibility, that's wonderful and it's really important. But if we are making accessible the same old financial infrastructure that has led us to the brink of war again, and to violent enforcement of inequality and various aspects which we may not want to do, then that's not really a wonderful thing, right? But if we are making accessible new and different forms of wealth, which are based fundamentally on knowing that you are just as you are, whole, and be fundamentally in relationship with others, that there is this reciprocity at the heart of what we define wealth to be, then perhaps that is something worthy of being made accessible.
Yeah, beautiful. Let me comment on both of those things, and I'd love to hear your thoughts too, because I've been talking a lot in these past few minutes. But first on kind of the definition of wealth. I mean, one of the things we recognized early on in the Celo community is that GDP is used as a measure of well-being, and it's a really poor measure of well-being. In that it both confutes means for medians, and also that it confutes consumption for well-being. And so basically kind of if you have a town where like 2 people are buying yachts and everybody else is starving, like the GDP of that is high. Similarly, kind of like if I were to both consume a whole bunch of McDonald's and also consume a whole bunch of healthcare, like my contribution to GDP would be higher than if I grew vegetables in my garden and was healthy. And so what we had come up with kind of as a community is 2 different measures of wealth or well-being, which is one or 2 different qualitative measures, which is one is people are growing along their own path, and second is people are helping one another. So the growing on one's own path is unique purpose, and the people helping each other is connectedness. And once you start there, you can imagine a whole variety of metrics that will measure those 2 things. And then the last thing that I want to say is that I'm so happy you brought up the point of stories. Like stories, I think, are probably one of the most important things that we can do. One way that I think about all of these new currencies that are coming out into the world is that they are like biological signaling molecules, basically. And in times when we have a bunch of biological signaling models in our own bodies in the form of like hormones during adolescence, like basically kind of the people who I've found to be the most thoughtful educators, Maria Montessori and Rudolf Steiner, they talk about the importance of stories during that time, during the time when there's lots of signaling molecules happening. And so at a macro level, that we're now introducing a whole bunch of signaling molecules, the stories form an organizing force to the creation and flow of those signaling molecules. And so I'm glad, that might be the most important thing we can be doing right now. So I'll pause there.
And I think just to jump in, and I know we're at time, so I think just to bring it back to this group as well. I mean, Step and I were on the call earlier, and we were saying like how much the work that you're doing and the work that the Kernel Fellows are doing really just makes our hearts sing at Celo, because it's so, I think there's so much synergy. And I think I guess my call to action for all of you as you're working on these projects is like, how do we redefine, right, some of the measurements of success of crypto today? We're looking at like metrics like TVL, right? How do we kind of change the definition, right? And really look at kind of the number of lives that we're changing, the number of people that we're helping, the number of trees that we're planting, right? And I think that so many of you here are the future of crypto and the future of what we're all doing. And so I think, would encourage you to kind of think about this, and, we're happy to continue on the conversation past this as well.
Thank you. Sochi, I know you both have to go, but it's been truly a blessing to spend some time. I know that there's more deep dives that we might be able to do soon, maybe on how we take some of these ideas into our technical protocols. But for now, it's just been really meaningful to get a sense of the stories that have shaped you both as individuals. And of course, Rebecca, thank you so much. Andy, thank you so much for helping host today.
And thank you all. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with this amazing community.
Thank you.
All right. Well, see you guys soon. I think that Aaliyah is going to take us into our typical DJ booth. She's taking on the task, and from here we break to gather. So if you would like to join us there, please do. I'll put the link in the chat. There'll be a smaller group there in conversation, and some people who probably will stick around on the Zoom room as well. Aaliyah will be here at least for a little bit. DJ Aaliyah.